Hello everybody, hi, welcome to this video. My name is Louis and this video is all about administrative units. I've been spending some time figuring out and playing around with administrative units, restrictive administrative units, and if you already know what they do and how they work, well, skip to this time point in the video because I have a quiz question for you. If you don't know what they are, well, follow along because I've dumped my brain into a small video explaining on how I understand administrative units and restrictive administrative units. Stay tuned. Before I start diving into the details of administrative units, I want to explain the use case of why you want to use an administrative unit within your tenant. And let's say I have a tenant, which is loosec.be, and within my tenant I have regular groups, users, and devices, and I have assigned myself an Entra ID administrative role. This could be user administrator, this could be group administrator, this could be basically any Entra ID role. And this role is automatically applicable to any group, user, or device. It's just how Entra ID works. If you're part of the tenant, well, then my Entra ID role will be applicable to it. Good, now let's add an administrative unit to the drawing. So I've updated the drawing and let me explain the use case of why I would use an administrative unit. Let's say I have a company and I have a Japanese part of the company that is 8 hours away or has a totally different IT personnel, and they're maybe outsourced to a third party. And I want to give that team the capability to manage themselves because there's a way too big of time difference, maybe different laws apply there, maybe it's a different type of organization, and I want to give them their own way of managing themselves. So I can apply administrative roles to my administrative unit. I can give permissions via the administrative unit only to the administrative container, which I compare it to. An administrative unit could be compared to a container or mini organization, which I call Japan, and people who get an administrative role within the administrative unit, they can manage the groups, the users, or the devices depending on which permission they receive. So what is also interesting, even if I would need to do something for the Japanese team, even though I'm not part of a Japanese team, with my regular Entra ID administrative role, I would be able still to do administrative tasks on the Japanese groups, users, or devices. Now, if I introduce a restricted administrative unit, things change a bit. Now I've added a restricted administrative unit called Belgium. And let's say for my use case, the Belgian guys are kind of weird guys. They need to be protected at all times. And I want to make sure that only the people who have explicit permissions to manage those groups, users, or devices, that only they can do that. Meaning, if you have a permission which is granted to you on Entra ID level, those permissions will not go through to the Belgian team, because they are cut off, they are restricted. It's within the name itself. It's a restricted administrative unit. It's a cocoon and container on its own. And you can only manage the Belgian team when you have explicit permissions on the restrictive administrative unit. Meaning, even though I have Entra ID permissions, they do not apply to them. It's cut off up here. And also, my permissions are only if I have restricted administrative unit permissions. They only apply to that restrictive AU itself. It does not go out of scope. So in short, to summarize, if I have regular Entra ID permissions, I can apply my permissions to regular users or to administrative units. If I have permissions within an administrative unit, I can only apply these permissions to the administrative unit to which I have been given these permissions. If I have a restricted administrative unit, I only have permissions to the administrative unit I have given permissions to, but this unit is also protected from any permissions that have been given on a tenant-wide level. They are cut off, and only people who are especially assigned permissions can manage these users, groups, or devices. Alright, for the technical guys, let's get started with creating our own administrative units, and we can do this by going to the entra.microsoft.com portal, go to admin units, click on add, and here we can create two types of administrative units. And let me start with creating a restrictive or an RAU, which means this is a group or a container which is going to be cut off of my regular Entra ID permissions. If you click on restrictive management administrative units, it's a mouthful, and you click on yes, then you're creating an RAU, meaning that the tenant level wide permissions aren't going to be applicable on the people, the devices, the groups within that administrative unit. Now, think very carefully before you do this, because once you do this, you cannot undo this. Once you've created an RAU and you do review and create and to complete the whole wizard, it stays an RAU until you delete it. So if you change your mind, you'll have to redo this and reconfigure everything and everywhere you use this RAU for. Now, if we would create a regular administrative unit and we would set this to no, then you can also create it, but you cannot upgrade it to a restrictive administrative unit. Meaning you have to decide from in the beginning, is it going to be restricted or is it just going to be an administrative unit? That's very important before you begin. In the next part, we're going to assign permissions to our administrative unit or restrictive administrative unit. And you'll see out of the box, you can apply 16 kinds of administrative roles to your AU. You'll also notice that you can apply custom roles. You can see I have created RAU custom role, which is a custom one, which you can create yourselves. These you can create yourselves. Just add a new custom role and test, do next. Here we can assign permissions that you want to have available in your administrative unit. Now there's one very important thing, because the rule set of permissions which is applicable here and available here is way bigger than the actual permissions that are available of all the permissions together here. Meaning, if I would combine all of the permissions here and combine all of the permissions here, my permissions in my custom role would be much more bigger than within my administrative unit. Meaning, whatever I create here won't always be able to be applicable within my administrative unit. And I have one big example or one big use case for that, for example, because one of the common use cases I have is, well, I have my Japanese team and they only have access to the Japanese users, but they also want to be able to read the audit logs of the users. Did he perform a password reset successfully, yes or no? Well, then I would give them the audit logs all properties read, allowing them to read audit logs, well, in this case, tenant-wide, because I have no other option. Well, too bad, Louis, because you cannot do that, because this is not something that is scopable to a restrictive administrative unit or an AU, meaning this custom role won't show up within my selection list of selecting or granting a permission to that administrative unit. Too bad. So you have to make sure that if you create a custom role, that the permission set is within the same existence of all the administrative roles that are. All right, for those who immediately skip to my question and already understand restrictive administrative units or AUs, welcome. Those who followed the introduction, thank you for sticking with me and following my explanation. Hope you learned something, hopefully. If not, here's my question. Now let's say that I'm a group administrator and group administrator within a restrictive administrative unit, and that restrictive administrative unit is called Belgium, and I have group administrator. Now, as a group administrator within that AU or that RAU, meaning I have no permissions, only, well, that's how I understand it, inside of my AU, can I add a user which exists within my regular tenant, and can I add that user, for example, to a group? Can I do this? Yes or no? Answer now. All right, so let's start by putting my question to the test. I have created an RAU, a restrictive administrative unit, company region Belgium. And if I go and check on roles and administrators, and I check here for groups administrators, I can see from active assignments that Lee Gu, which is the user I'm signed in with, is the user administrator, which is directly assigned to the scope of my RAU. Perfect. So that would mean, with my understanding, that only I have permissions within that restrictive administrative unit. Interesting. So let's go back to my RAU, go to my Belgium one, go to groups, and create a new group. And let's say quiz answer. Now, I can create a new group, membership assigned, and I can do no members. And just let me take somebody. Let me take, for example, Gracie, which I know is not part of any AU or not part of my RAU yet. And I do select, and I do create. And suddenly, I have picked a user which I do not have any permission set on, which is part of, meanwhile, let me load let it load in the background. But basically what happened is Gracie was first here. Part of my regular users, part to be managed of my regular Entra ID roles. And I only had the group administrator role within my RAU. And I just created a new group and suddenly took that user and made it member of a group which is part of the RAU. Meaning, if for any reason that group is being used in any policy, let's say a security policy, or those group are managed in Intune to or conditional access for hardening reasons, and I do a misclick or something else, well, this means that the Entra ID administrative rules and that user is added to one of these groups, they won't be able to do anything because they are added to the RAU groups and they won't be able to edit that group. They'll have to add them themselves. So I can take users, pull them in the context of a different group, and the people who have tenant-wide permissions won't be able to act upon it. So I can basically drag a user into a different context, and on Entra ID level and tenant-wide level, they won't be able to do anything. Well, they will be able, because you'll eventually always have a global administrator, for example, who can make himself member of a restrictive administrative unit, but not everybody will be able to do something. So that's something that I think, that's strange. That's not something on how I thought it worked, but it does. Meanwhile, the permissions will have loaded, a couple of minutes have passed, and if I do a big refresh, I haven't done anything different, I can see in my RAU company region Belgium that my quiz answer group has been added, and that if I look into total members, view group members, I can see that Grady Archie has been added as a user that is part of a group that is part of my RAU. Meaning, in order to kick Grady Archie out of this group, the tenant-wide administrators will have to grant themselves group administrator again to kick Grady out, which is, well, for me, not something I expected to happen, but in reality, it is possible to happen. So this concludes my video about administrative units. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you might have discovered something new, or if not, it might have been a great repetition of what you already knew. Thank you for clicking. Thank you for watching. Leave a comment, leave a feedback, and subscribing is very much appreciated, and see you next time.